Mr. Speaker, in the St. Lucia Labour Party, in its manifesto for the 2021 general elections, entitled Putting You First, You the People, on page 16 stated the following. In dialogue and consultation with health officials, education officials, and advocates for marijuana legalization, we shall develop a medicinal and recreational cannabis industry. We shall undertake to do the following. 1. Provide the necessary resources to create and maintain a sustainable and vibrant market for cannabis regionally and internationally. And 2. Expunge the records of crimes related to the possession of small quantities of cannabis. And 3. Decriminalize the use of marijuana to be followed by its eventual legislation. I'm pleased to report, Mr. Speaker, that we have achieved number 2 in this Honorable House by expunging the records of crimes relating to the possession of small quantities of cannabis. And in keeping with our pledge, Mr. Speaker, the same way we pledged that we would remove facility fees, and we've done so, we are embarking on number 3, which is to decriminalize the use of marijuana. And that is being done by the amendment to the Drugs Prevention and Misuse Act, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the business of drugs and marijuana and cannabis has been fought for many years. And the jury is still out whether we have succeeded in the war on cannabis, Mr. Speaker. That war has been waged for many years, and the people who have suffered the most are the members of the real Rastafari brethren who have been harassed, molested. Some of them have been discriminated against disrespected because of their belief in the use of marijuana as the holy herb. But, Mr. Speaker, this government believes in human rights, and this government believes in respecting the rights of all individuals. But, Mr. Speaker, this amendment today is part of a phased process, a process that will happen in phases, Mr. Speaker. We know that there was a start with the Cannabis Commission report, which, unlike how the former government treated us, we were involved in the discussions on the report, and we agreed to a large extent with what is possible, with what is in that report, Mr. Speaker. We've always said when we're in opposition that we would work with the government on matters that were beneficial to the people of St. Lucia. And when in government, we always involved the opposition in matters that were significant. Example, in the citizenship by investment policy, the then Prime Minister involved the opposition deeply in the process, Mr. Speaker. We will not treat them how they treated us by denying our constituents the basic necessities for their life. We will not do them what they did us, Mr. Speaker. That is why in our school support, we offered to both the constituencies that were represented by opposition parliamentarians. A far cry to what they did us. A far cry to what they did us when we were in government. Mr. Speaker, and we didn't ask them to cry. We'll never ask them to cry, Mr. Speaker, never. We know they represent the people of St. Lucia. We'll never ask them to cry. Mr. Speaker, this morning we intend through a phased process to decriminalize up to 40 grams of cannabis initially for one's personal use, with more comprehensive legislation and regulations for the entire cannabis industry to come later. Let me make it clear, Mr. Speaker. This is not a signal for people to start consuming cannabis irresponsibly, especially in public spaces. To get respect, one must give respect. And I mean, one must respect other people's right to breathe clean, smoke-free air. There are people with conditions such as asthma, allergies, and COPD, and other respiratory symptoms that may negatively be affected if you smoke in public, Mr. Speaker. By improving the regulatory framework in the Misuse of Drugs Act, people are able to smoke 30 grams of marijuana without being arrested or charged by the police. By improving the regulatory framework in the Misuse of Drugs Act, we will now be able to address the public health issues associated with cannabis consumption, underage use, and the predisposition to psychosis, with cannabis being a trigger and overdosing. We will now be able to roll out our national education program, which will include prevention and harm reduction strategies. We can educate our people on the rules and regulations, as well as implementing both the necessary social and physical infrastructure to deal with this regime. The new legislation is the start, which will allow us to develop a cannabis industry that reports show could provide jobs when fully developed and can contribute dollars to the government's coffers. And to the Rastafarian brothers, the government extends its sincere apologies to your community for the immense suffering that you have endured over the decades under this law. The Rastafarian brothers and sisters. Mr. Speaker, the Drugs Prevention Amendment Bill under the Act, cannabis is deemed a controlled drug by virtue of Schedule 2. As such, pursuant to the Act, a person is found to be in possession if the person has quantities of more than 15 grams of cannabis or cannabis resin. Further, according to the Act, the prosecution and punishment such possession attracts a summary conviction of a maximum term of imprisonment of 3 years or fine not exceeding $100,000. In addition, under this Act, if a person is found with a quantity of more than 15 grams of cannabis in his or her possession, that person is in possession of a controlled drug for the purpose of supplying it to another, and this is a contravention of the Act. This is a separate offense from simple possession, and as such carries a separate penalty, which attracts a maximum penalty of between 3 to 14 years imprisonment. Therefore, a person charged with possession of a quantity of cannabis exceeding 50 grams may and could have been charged with possession for the purposes of supplying it to another. This amendment, Mr. Speaker, amends the Act to decriminalize small quantities of cannabis by allowing the possession of up to 30 grams. However, there are restrictions as it relates to the possession of cannabis. Firstly, a person is prohibited from smoking cannabis in public places, such as bars and restaurants, and is liable on summary conviction to a fine not exceeding $1,500. Another amendment to the Act is that a person under the age of 18 that is a child or young person who is found with cannabis will be required to participate in a drug counseling program that is approved by the minister. Mr. Speaker, this amendment is the first stage in more comprehensive legislation to deal with the cannabis industry. Mr. Speaker, what we are doing today is we are relieving the law enforcement from the burden of having to arrest and take to court people found in possession of less than 30 grams of marijuana. This, Mr. Speaker, and remember, we already expunged from the records, we will expunge from the records anybody who was imprisoned or convicted for that. Mr. Speaker, that will relieve resources to law enforcement to deal with more serious crimes, Mr. Speaker, including crimes of corruption and white-collar crime. Mr. Speaker, I will now refer to certain sections of the bill for the consideration of honorable members, Mr. Speaker. And note, Mr. Speaker, as I said before, this is just the first stage in more comprehensive cannabis legislation that will eventually lead to cannabis being used, if found feasible, and under the Cannabis Commission report, it was found to be feasible, cannabis for export and medicinal use, and which would help in foreign exchange and employment, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to refer you to the section 8, Mr. Speaker, of the Act. Section 8, restriction of possession of controlled drugs. And that is amended, Mr. Speaker, in clause 3 of the bill to change the quantity of cannabis or cannabis resin that is considered to be possession from 15 grams to 30 grams. So that means if you found with 30 grams of marijuana, you will not be arrested by the police. Clause 4, Mr. Speaker, of the bill inserts a new section, Section 8A to the Act, to provide for an exemption from criminal liability for possession of less than 30 grams. You will not be criminally liable if you have less than 30 grams. In Clause 5, Mr. Speaker, of the bill, a new section, 14A, is added to the Act to make provision for treatment and programs for a child or young person, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that that young person who is below the age of 18 gets adequately treated if they are found with 30 grams of marijuana, Mr. Speaker, of cannabis. Mr. Speaker, a new section, Section 27A, is added to the Act, to the Act, Mr. Speaker. And I want to refer honorable members to 27AB, AB2, Mr. Speaker. It says that it's prohibited for the use or open to the public for any similar space access to the public in a bar, a restaurant, or club. An establishment, except for such area forming part of the establishment as may be specifically designated by management of the establishment as an area where smoking is permitted, Mr. Speaker. So that means that you can smoke in a specified designated smoking area in a restaurant or bar, but it must be specified as a smoking area, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, it also says, Mr. Speaker, that if you are at your home, in your private residence, you can smoke a joint without being arrested by the police, but only in the confines of your private residence, Mr. Speaker. At your home, in your yard, at your home, not in public, Mr. Speaker. use, we still are not allowing the smoking of marijuana in public places. This is a private thing that you do in a bar, once the bar has a smoking area, or in your yard, in your premises, under your roof, you can smoke a joint. That is very important, Mr. Speaker, because you know how the agents of misinformation will begin to peddle their misinformation. This is just the first stage in comprehensive legislation for the use of cannabis and for the cannabis industry as a whole, Mr. Speaker. And there is also a Cannabis Commission report which involved the government, the then government, and the opposition in a cannabis report, Mr. Speaker. And you must also note that many countries in the CARICOM have gone this way. St. Lucia is not new. In fact, there are countries in Europe and countries in the United States that have even extended it further. So St. Lucia is not new. All we are doing is we are respecting the rights of people, particularly the rights of the Rastafarian brethren. I know there are questions about using marijuana for the religious services of the Rastafari. But again, when the legislation, comprehensive legislation, is agreed to by its Honorable House, then there will be a specific policy as it relates to the use of the herb by the Rastafarian brethren. But for now, they can smoke the herb in the private. I see the former police officer is laughing at me. So right now, Mr. Speaker, they can smoke the herb in the confines of the home. Now, Mr. Speaker, before I end, there are hypocrisies in society that will pretend as if that doesn't exist now, Mr. Speaker. It exists now. It exists already. All we are doing is you are removing the pressure on the police and allowing them, and they'll be called very soon, Mr. Speaker, to address more serious crime, including corruption. Mr. Speaker, I want to ask honorable members to agree to this bill. I think it's progressive legislation. I think it's legislation that is keeping with the times, Mr. Speaker. And the same way, the alcohol is sold everywhere, in shops, in containers, in coolers, Mr. Speaker, and everybody is not a drunkard. Everybody doesn't drink. I do not think that this bill will make everybody smoke. It doesn't make logical sense, Mr. Speaker. All it says is if you are over 18 and you choose to smoke, you will not smoke in public places, you will not influence younger people below the age of 18 to smoke, and you will smoke in the privacy of your home, and you should not be in possession of more than 30 grams of cannabis, Mr. Speaker. And as I said, this is the start of more comprehensive legislation. We know that there are loopholes that may come up, but that is the start of more comprehensive legislation for the cannabis industry generally. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.